Member from Battleford's Lloydminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So, for 2.5 months, this House has been seized with this privilege motion. We are still waiting on documents that were ordered by this House months ago. Documents that would shed light on the misuse of taxpayer dollars through the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Green Slush Fund. Despite a clear parliamentary order, the Liberal government has refused to comply, obstructing the vital work of Parliament and undermining the principles of transparency and of accountability. Meanwhile, Canadians are hurting, and this NDP Liberal government is failing them. The issues facing Canadians are only growing more and more severe. Yet, this Liberal government persists in its efforts to evade transparency and accountability. From the skyrocketing costs of housing and basic necessities to the ever-increasing food inflation, the pain felt by everyday Canadians is undeniable. And yet, instead of tackling these issues head-on, the government has chosen to prolong its cover-up of ethical failures. Canadians are left to suffer while the Prime Minister and the Liberal government is busy protecting its own. After 9 years of this Prime Minister's leadership, the price of groceries has skyrocketed, and food insecurity has become one of the most urgent issues facing Canadians. Food Banks Canada reported that in March of this year, there were more than 2 million visits to the food bank. That is a staggering increase of 90% since 2019. Canadians are already struggling with the cost of food, but unfortunately, things are set to get even worse. This was confirmed by Canada's food price report for 2025. The average Canadian family of four will have to spend $800 more on food in the coming year. That $800, Mr. Speaker, is on top of the year-over-year increases on food, bringing the average total family spend on food to $16,833. Meat and vegetables are expected to see an even higher price hike, with the cost of meat rising from 4 to 6% and vegetables by 4 to 5%. The rise in costs for nutritious food are particularly alarming given the growing number of reports on scurvy here in Canada. It has gotten so dire that doctors in Canada have been warned to consider scurvy as a potential diagnosis for their patients. And now in northern Saskatchewan, 27 cases of scurvy have been diagnosed. In each of these cases, the patients had one thing in common: a lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in their diet. This was once a disease that was associated with sailors on long sea voyages and is now a growing concern in Canada due to limited access of affordable and nutritious food. And to be clear, the NDP Liberals' 2-month tax trick on chips and chocolate is not going to provide vulnerable Canadians with the nutrition that they so desperately need. Mr. Speaker, scurvy should be unimaginable in Canada, but that is this Prime Minister's record. The rise in food insecurity is a direct result of the Prime Minister's carbon tax. Food prices have risen 36% faster in Canada than in the United States, where there is no carbon tax. The reality is simple. If you tax the farmer who grows the food and the trucker who ships the food, ultimately you end up taxing the family who buys the food. Instead of giving Canadians tangible, permanent relief, the NDP Liberal government is preparing to hike the carbon tax again next year. In the middle of a persistent affordability crisis, they are hell-bent on making life more expensive for Canadians. And the carbon tax obsessed Prime Minister is determined to quadruple this carbon tax to 61 cents per litre by 2030. Canadians want a carbon tax election. But this NDP Liberal coalition continues to hold the interests of Canadians hostage. With their lust for power and their backroom deals, the NDP Liberal coalition is refusing to face the consequences of their policies at the ballot box. And Canadians cannot afford to wait any longer for relief from the damaging policies of this government. That is why, in light of the fall economic statement being delivered today, Conservatives have one simple demand: stop. Stop all planned tax hikes, especially the carbon tax hike, that will further increase the cost of food, gas, home heating, and basic necessities. Stop fueling inflation by cutting wasteful inflationary spending. Wasteful spending like the $390 million worth of contracts handed out through the Liberals' Green Slush Fund. That includes the $58 million taxpayer dollars that went to 10 ineligible projects, the $334 million taxpayer dollars that went to 186 projects that involved conflict of interest, and the $58 million taxpayer dollars given to projects without ensuring that the terms of the contribution agreement were met. But that's not enough. This Liberal government needs to stop adding to Canada's debt. That's right. Conservatives are calling for a dollar-for-dollar law that requires a new spending be offset with an equal amount of savings. This afternoon's fall economic statement should confirm that the deficit for this year and last year has not risen above the already reckless $40 billion guardrail that the finance minister promised in this year's budget. Unfortunately, there is no reason to believe that this Prime Minister or Mark Carney, the phantom finance minister, will heed our common sense recommendations, or at the very least maintain their already reckless so-called fiscal guardrail. The Parliamentary Budget Officer has said that the deficit could be as high as $46.5 billion. The Prime Minister's former budget director has come out and said, quote, "Over the past few years, the federal government has consistently prioritized short-sighted decisions over long-term fiscal and economic stability." And the Prime Minister's own former budget director does not have faith that the government will show fiscal restraint that is needed in the fall economic statement. But it is far from just the former budget director raising concerns with the anticipated fall economic statement. This morning, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance resigned from Cabinet. She has arguably been the most loyal Cabinet Minister to the Prime Minister. But even she is now raising alarm bells in the face of the Prime Minister's bullish tactics to spend taxpayer dollars rashly in a reckless attempt to save himself. The now former Finance Minister has admitted that excessive spending drives inflation. Her letter of resignation this morning confirms that the Prime Minister's decisions are short-sighted. Today's decisions will have long-term repercussions for Canadians. That is why the former budget director also warned, quote, You can't pick and choose fiscal anchors as you go and renege on the commitment you made only a year ago. The fact of the matter is this government is losing control of public finances, and Canadians are noticing. Well, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are indeed noticing. Canadians cannot help but notice, because it is Canadians who will always pay the price for this Prime Minister and his costly failures. That's right. It is Canadian taxpayers who are on the hook for the waste and the mismanagement in the Green Slush Fund. And it is not just the Green Slush Fund. Their mismanagement is a pattern. The Auditor General has now revealed that the Liberal government's $50 billion CEBA program is their latest boondoggle. The Liberals paid out $3.5 billion in taxpayers' money through the CEBA program to over 77,000 recipients who did not meet eligibility requirements. That means that 9% of the program's recipients were ineligible. The Auditor General's report determined that the Ministry of Finance failed to provide effective oversight of the CEBA program. Even worse, the Liberal government awarded 92% of the total contracts to Accenture in a non-competitive process. Accenture then took that money and then performed much of the work in Brazil instead of Canada. That work was done in Brazil, despite the Liberal government's own claims of supporting Canadian jobs. This is a government that has no regard for taxpayers' hard-earned money. This NDP Liberal coalition's failures are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are real costs to Canadian families who are already struggling with skyrocketing costs of living. The Liberal government's high tax and high deficit agenda is fueling inflation, and it is the most vulnerable who are the hardest hit. Lower-income Canadians are disproportionately suffering from this government's inflationary policies. And it's time for a government that puts Canadians first, not its own political interests. Canadians need a Prime Minister who understands the economic realities that they are facing, a Prime Minister that is focused on the long-term prosperity of Canadians. Yet, what do we hear from this Prime Minister? Let the bankers worry about the economy. That recent display of incompetence from the Prime Minister follows memorable comments like, budgets balance themselves, and you'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy. After 9 years of his failed leadership, it is no wonder Canadians are struggling to keep a roof over their head and food on their table. Everything is broken. This NDP Liberal government has doubled the debt, doubled housing costs, caused the worst inflation in 40 years, and has sent 2 million people to the food bank. Canada's GDP per capita is smaller than it was when this Prime Minister took office. Canada has the most indebted households in the G7, the worst housing inflation, and food prices have risen 37% faster in Canada than in the United States. Our economy is teetering on the brink of collapse, and now Canadians are forced with the threat of 25% tariffs on our shrinking economy. Canadians need a Prime Minister with the brains and with a backbone to stand up for Canada. And Canadians deserve a Prime Minister who actually worries about the economy and who will work for their future and who will take action to fix the mess that this government has created. A Prime Minister that will restore the Canadian promise that hard work leads to powerful paychecks and pensions, that buys affordable groceries and homes in safe neighbourhoods. The clock is running out on the NDP Liberal coalition's backroom deals. Canadians will go to the polls in the coming year, and they will have a clear choice. A choice between the NDP Liberal coalition, which will continue to tax your food, punish your work, and let crime spiral out of control, or the common sense Conservatives, who will axe the carbon tax, who will build affordable homes, who will fix the budget, and who will stop the crime. Our common sense plan is one of opportunity for all Canadians. A plan that rewards hard work, not who you know. Because while Canadians have been struggling with the rising costs over the last 9 years of this Prime Minister's leadership, the only ones who seem to have gotten ahead are Liberals and Liberal insiders. The issues surrounding the Liberal Sustainable Development Technology Canada Green Slush Fund are far from isolated incidents. They've been part of a disturbing pattern of mismanagement, lack of accountability, and an outright disregard for hard-earned taxpayer dollars. That is the legacy of this Liberal government, an increasing cost of living that is making it difficult for Canadians to afford basic necessities while demonstrating a blatant disregard for transparency and accountability. Canadians cannot afford the corruption of this NDP Liberal government. The failure to provide the documents ordered by this House is not merely an obstruction. It is an affront to the very principles of transparency and accountability that are essential to the proper functioning of our democracy. This is not just a matter of parliamentary procedure. Ultimately, this comes down to the health of our democracy. That is why Conservatives are persistent with our demands. The Prime Minister could bring this months-long debate to a close if he respected the motion passed in the House and delivered on the production of documents. The refusal to fully release the requested documents is a deliberate attempt to prevent the Canadian public from understanding the full extent of this Liberal government's corruption and mismanagement. And in doing that, those responsible get to evade accountability. This Liberal government has shown time and time again that it values protecting its own interests over the interests of Canadians. Whether it is allowing the $400 million in misused funds to go unchecked, or failing to address the growing economic hardship faced by millions of Canadians, the government's actions, or their lack of, speaks volumes. Canadians cannot afford to continue down this path of unchecked spending and hidden truths. Accountability, Mr. Speaker, is not a luxury. It's a necessity in a democracy. The time for cover-ups and evasive behaviour is over. Canadians deserve a government that upholds its duty to them. A government that ensures every dollar is spent responsibly and that those responsible for mismanagement are held accountable. The Green Slush Fund scandal is just one example of how this NDP Liberal government's lack of transparency has eroded public trust. The longer that it continues to obstruct the production of documents, the deeper the damage to our democracy. It is time for the Liberal government to stop protecting insiders and start listening to the Canadians who elected them. It is time for the Prime Minister and his government to stop hiding and to start facing the reality of their actions. It is time for them to end the cover-up, to restore trust in our public institutions, and to begin putting Canadians first. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need transparency, accountability, and most of all, Canadians need a government that works for them, not for itself. It is time for a carbon tax election. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important to emphasize to those that would be following the debate or following what it is that the Conservatives have been saying inside the chamber and outside the chamber for years now, Mr. Speaker, and that is quite simply that Canada is not broken. That, in fact, we are still the best country in the world to call home, Mr. Speaker. If you take a look in terms of interest rates compared to the rest of the world, Canada is doing exceptionally well. If you take a look at the issue of inflation compared to the rest of the world, Canada is doing exceptionally well. If you take a look at in terms of the hard jobs number, we're virtually double the number of jobs that Stephen Harper, in which the leader of the Conservative Party sat around that cabinet, more than double the number of jobs in the same time period. We have all sorts of national programs, from the school food program to a pharmacare program to a dental care program. Lots of wonderful things that are actually happening. Canada is not broken. I'm wondering if the member opposite would at the very least acknowledge that in fact Canada still is the very best place in the world to call home, and that in fact, contrary to what her leader says, Canada is not broken.
Order for Battleford's Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is, in my opinion, the best country in the world. We do have the best people. I go home every weekend and I speak with Canadians who have never used a food bank before that are now using a food bank, who are losing their house because they don't have a job. This government, where I'm from, has attacked our energy sector, our agriculture sector, to the point that the people that were working in these wonderful careers are now using food banks. I want to repeat something that I spoke in my speech because I don't think the member across was listening. Canada has the most indebted households in the G7, the worst housing inflation, and food prices have risen 37% faster in Canada than in the United States. Mr. Speaker, I would just ask that the member opposite actually talk to his constituents and hear what they're saying.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is the first time I'm speaking to you as Bloc Whip, and it's an honour for me to take on that responsibility. Thank you. But the circumstances are somewhat extraordinary, let's put it that way, uncommon. And since the circumstances are so extraordinary, I'll take this opportunity, because I may not have another one, to wish everyone happy holidays and all my constituents in Berthier-Masquinongé, whom I represent. Now, my question for the member who just spoke is, we've rarely seen such a high degree of lack of confidence in the government. The finance minister has stepped down on the day of the economic statement. There's a bit of a feeling that we're seeing unprecedented, if not surreal, situations. Now, the Bloc withdrew its confidence from the government quite a while ago, but I'd like my colleague to say, in her opinion, what's going to happen next? Thank you.
Battleford's Lloydminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And through you, congratulations on the new role and the new responsibility that my colleague gets to bear. So congratulations for that. It's quite interesting, actually. We know that the NDP has voted confidence in this Liberal government, not sometime, all the time, literally all the time. And we do know that right before the Elmwoods-Transcona by-election, that the leader of the NDP ripped up that supply and confidence agreement, and we know that that was a big drama production and that was a show. But you know what's really interesting, actually, is in the finance minister's letter that was released today, quote, she said, or I should say former finance minister, quote, they know when we are, referring to Canadians, they know when we are working for them, and they equally know when we are focused on ourselves. Inevitably, our time in government will come to an end. What's so shocking about that is the NDP don't get it. They don't not get it. They keep having confidence in this Prime Minister when the Deputy Prime Minister doesn't even have confidence in him. I don't get it.
Questions and comments? The order for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I love our honourable colleague. Her intervention, as always, is fantastic and to the point. She speaks from the heart, and she speaks for her constituents in her riding, Mr. Speaker. Lloydminster, that's correct. Mr. Speaker, the honourable parliamentary secretary stood up and said, oh, you know, everything's great, but 7 million Canadians are without a doctor. 2 million Canadians are going into food banks every month. 47,000 Canadians have died from the opioid crisis in this country. That's this government's record. Scandal after scandal, corruption after corruption. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't like that 9 years ago before this government took place, and it won't be like that when Canadians elect a strong Conservative government, I wonder if our honourable colleague, just want to give her another opportunity to talk about what she hears on the doorsteps in her riding of Lloydminster. Thank you.
The honourable member for Battleford Lloydminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the kind words. You know, it's just so sad, especially coming up to Christmas. I was at the grocery store on the weekend and seeing people that had to take things off of the conveyor belt to put it back. And I mean, what's baffling to me and what I don't understand is, you know, what we're debating today is the Liberal government's failure to produce documents that they were ordered to by this place, and the lengths that they would go to cover it up. Whatever's in those documents must be very damning, that they are willing to go to this extent to keep covering up the corruption and the mismanagement of taxpayer dollars, which is ultimately hurting Canadians. And as I said in my remarks, it's hurting the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable, those that are on the brink of losing their house, those that are not feeding themselves. I referred to scurvy. There's scurvy diagnoses happening in Saskatchewan, in Canada. Unacceptable.
And comments? The honourable member St. Albert Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, I would observe that we live in the greatest country. However, we have the worst Prime Minister and the worst government in Canadian history. This is a Prime Minister who long ago lost the moral authority to govern. But today, if there was any doubt, we have seen that this government has lost its ability to carry on the very functions of government, because in 4 hours, the government is to present the fall economic statement. The problem is that there's no finance minister. The finance minister resigned in what is truly unprecedented, a set of circumstances demonstrating that this Prime Minister has lost all control. The member spoke about the fact that, notwithstanding that the leader of the NDP ripped up his coalition agreement with this costly and corrupt government, the leader of the NDP has propped up this government on confidence vote after confidence vote after confidence vote. 3 times. She said she doesn't understand why. I would put it to the member that the reason the leader of the NDP is propping up this Prime Minister is to pad his pocket with a $2.3 million pension. Pension over Canadians. That's the priority of the leader of the NDP. Would the member agree?
The honourable member for Battleford Lloydminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, through you, to my colleague for that question/statement. Yeah, I absolutely do agree that the leader of the NDP cares about himself, his own self-interests, padding his pension, making sure he checks that box, and he doesn't care who he's hurting in the way. It doesn't matter if it's his own caucus, who many of them will not return to this place because they are not putting the interests of Canadians first, and Canadians. He literally has voted to increase the carbon tax time and time again. He pretends he doesn't like the Liberals and their confidence and supply agreement, and he literally rips it up and tapes it back together. It's just so sad and so disheartening that some can be so selfish and only care about themselves when our fellow Canadians are hurting.